When Title IX was passed in 1972, only 16,000 women were participating in collegiate sports. But now, more than 40 years later, there are over 200,000 women playing collegiate sports. Title IX was intended to put an end to the discrimination of women in many aspects of educational life, including sports, and it has been successful in doing so. However, men believe that it has come at their own expense. Male athletes claim that they have suffered several unintended consequences as a result of Title IX, and they want these problems to be resolved. So today I'm going to talk about how Title IX has inadvertently impacted male athletes, especially at the collegiate and Olympic levels. In particular, I'm going to talk about first, what has happened to the number of men's athletic programs, second, what has happened to men's scholarship funding, and third, what has happened to the competitiveness of men's U.S. Olympic teams. And I'm going to talk about the causes for all of these. So first, the number of men's athletic programs have changed because a lot of schools have been forced to cut programs from their school. According to a 2007 study from the American Sports Council, the number of men's teams decreased by 17% from 1981 to 2005. Now, a lot of people might try to blame Title IX for this, but they aren't responsible. In fact, they don't even tell schools how they need to enforce gender equality in sports. Instead, that's the NCAA's responsibility. The NCAA, in order to comply with Title IX, has forced institutions to observe certain proportionality requirements or participation requirements in order to ensure that women are being treated equally in sports. Now, the most common way that schools choose to show that they are treating women equally is through proportionality. Under proportionality, institutions must show that the number of male and female athletes is substantially proportionate to the number of males and females on the entire campus. So let's say that if the number of women on campus is 55%, then 55% of the school's athletes must also be women. So it has to be substantially proportionate. Now, although this was intended to help women, it has actually caused schools to cut men's programs. For example, if a school has a problem with proportionality and they need to increase the number of female athletes, they have one of two options. They can increase the number of female athletes either by bringing more in or by creating new sports and new teams, or, which is actually a really expensive alternative, or they can remove men's sports from their schools, which is much less costly. And so this has actually become the common trend for schools who are dealing with these proportionality issues. So now that we've talked about how the number of men's athletic programs has decreased since Title IX, we can talk about what's happened to men's scholarship funding. Since Title IX was passed, the number of scholarships that men's sports have received has actually decreased. Data from ESPNW actually compares side by side the scholarships available for men's sports and women's sports, and it becomes very clear that women receive more scholarships than men. For example, according to the data, it shows that men's volleyball only receives 4.5 scholarships, while women's volleyball receives 12. And this trend is very consistent throughout the sports, with the exception of lacrosse and maybe a couple of other sports. It is overwhelmingly consistent that men's sports receive fewer scholarships than their counterpart women's sports. And a lot of people also like to blame Title IX for this, and once again, this isn't true. The NCAA is also responsible for creating limitations that require schools to give scholarship dollars that are proportional to the number of male and female athletes. This means that, going back to my earlier example, that if women make up 55% of the students at school, then not only do 55% of the athletes have to be women, but also 55% of the scholarship dollars have to go to women. Now, supporters of Title IX believe that the NCAA supports high revenue sports and that this is also contributing to the limited number of scholarships available for men's sports. ESPNW actually proves and confirms that the NCAA does in fact support high revenue sports. For example, football, which is arguably the highest revenue sport in college athletics, they can fund about 3.86 starting lineups with the amount of scholarships that sport receives, whereas a low revenue sport like water polo can only fund 0.64 starting lineups with scholarships they receive. Now, it's already enough that the NCAA limits the number of scholarships available for men, but the fact that they're supporting these high revenue sports is only making matters worse for some of these men's sports. So, finally, the competitiveness of the U.S. men's Olympic teams has decreased since Title IX. And the reason for this is because of the program cuts that have happened to many sports, especially gymnastics, which is an Olympic sport. And because these sports have been cut, it's been taking away from the talent pool that's available for the Olympics. For example, 212 gymnastics programs have been cut in the United States since 1969. And among those was the University of California, Los Angeles, which at the time was arguably the most prestigious program and was a huge source for Olympic talent. And now without that, and now with only 18 programs left in the country, the pool for Olympic talent or for potential Olympic talent is smaller than ever. And so it's caused the competitiveness of the U.S. men's gymnastics team to decrease. It's much harder for them to compete with the rest of the world when they have fewer options or a fewer selection of Olympians to choose from. So, in conclusion, Title IX has had a lot of unintended impacts on men's sports. First, we've seen how through participation requirements that the NCAA has caused a lot of schools to cut men's sports from their athletic programs. Second, we've seen that the scholarship limits set by the NCAA have reduced the number of scholarships available for men, and that this, combined with the fact that the NCAA supports high revenue sports, is only making things worse for men's sports who need more financial aid. And finally, we've seen how program cuts, especially to gymnastics, has reduced the competitiveness of the U.S. men's Olympic teams. So based on all this, it's clear to see that Title IX isn't the problem here. The problem is that due to its implementation and due to their support for Title IX, that the NCAA is responsible for creating these problems for male athletes. And something has to be done about it. So I've made two recommendations. First, I recommend that the NCAA loosen and make its participation requirements less strict. And by doing so, they can continue to support equality for female athletes and promote their interests, but they won't have to cut men's sports. And second, I recommend that the NCAA allow colleges to allocate scholarships to men's and women's sports. And by doing so, they don't have to give all their money to football. They can take money from football and give some of that scholarship aid to other sports who may need it more than them. And it just makes things more equal. And it also helps offset the restrictions that are already in place by the NCAA limitations. Title IX was never meant to cause male athletes to suffer. But if we can implement these solutions, if the NCAA can make these changes, then they can put an end to the problems that they've caused for male athletes. And more importantly, they can continue to promote the interests of female athletes.